Okay, so I'm going to talk about Latinos in the US. So what I was thinking about this presentation is to give you something that you don't know about Latinos. Rather than just telling you that they are in Texas, California, or Florida in big numbers, I was looking for additional information that might be a little different to what you have heard so far. So I'm not going to be talking about Cinco de Mayo or Taco Tuesday, but rather other topics. All right? So yes, I'm from Ecuador in South America, but I came to the US in 2000. I spent about 20-something years in this beautiful country, 12 of them in New England and now in Florida, in Central Florida, which is my home right now. I'm very happy to be here with you tonight. So let's talk about the Americas before the discovery or the voyage, before 1492. That was kind of the overlapping of the tribes and their lands before the European immigrants came to this side of the Atlantic. So according to some historians, the population back in 1492 was about 60 million. Some of them estimate that population to be about 100 million people. And also in North America, for the native population of North America, a little south of 2 million people. Some historians think that it was as much as 3.5 million people in North America, which means that the balance, about 57, 58 million people were in the south, which is about 30 times more people in South America and Central America than in North America by 1492. So whereas in North America we have that chart that I just showed you before, the Spaniards, what they found in Central America and South America was a lot of people. They found entire civilizations. For instance, the Maya, who inhabited the Yucatan Peninsula, they have at least 40 cities ranking from 5,000 to 50,000 people there, with pyramids as high as 240 feet tall. So the Aztec that you have there, where right now is in central Mexico, where you have the capital of Mexico right now, they have Tenochtitlan, which was the capital, with 140,000 people living in there. And the Aztecs were about 6 million strong. So that was a large number of people just in central Mexico. Whereas in South America, you have the Inca Empire. Inca actually is a Quechua word, the language that the Incas spoke that means Lord. And actually the Incas were only about 40,000 strong. And they handled an empire of about 10 million people that comprised more than 500 different tribes. They dominated those tribes over the time. So you have the Inca Empire over the Andes, which extended from Ecuador, south of Colombia, to Chile in the south. And I just put two pictures down there. One is Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire in Mexico, with the pyramids and all of that, is the city on the lake. There's a fantastic tales about how the Spaniards conquered that city. And then on the right-hand side, you can see Machu Picchu in Peru. And as you can see that picture of Machu Picchu, actually that's not a real Inca city. It is, but what I'm trying to say is that when the Incas realized that they were losing the war against the Spaniards, they decided to move their aristocracy inside, into hidden places, to hid those cities from the Spaniards. And actually Machu Picchu needed about 400 and something years to be discovered. And it never was discovered by the Spaniards. They didn't know that that city existed, but the Incas just moved there, their aristocracy, just to be safe from the Spaniards. And if you wonder about the tribes that inhabit the Amazon jungle, when the Spaniards arrived to Americans, the Amazon jungle has no inhabitants. Actually, what happened in South America was that as the Spaniards were conquering and acquiring land, they were pushing the indigenous tribes into farther away. So they kind of were like, we don't want to deal with the Spaniards, we're going to go where they don't want to go. And they end up in the Amazon jungle. Well, we remained undisturbed until probably, I will say, the beginning of the 20th century. So that's fascinating. On the other side of the Atlantic, however, we have the Iberian Peninsula, where nowadays we have Spain and Portugal. And of course, that was also conquered by the Romans. The Romans were there for about 5 centuries. So, and they divided first the Iberian Peninsula in 3 departments, and then in 5, and then in 9. But as you can see, I want to point to your attention to the west of the map, where we have Lusitania, one of the 3 parts in which they divided the Iberian Peninsula. And Lusitania is nowadays Portugal. So a lot of people says that Hispanic is tied to the language, because Hispanic, Spanish, very similar, is the same Latin root. But as you can see in Hispania, you have Lusitania, which is tied to Portugal, the Portuguese. So that's an interesting factor. So Hispania is, again, it was the Roman province. Nowadays is Spain, and Hispanicus were the inhabitants of Hispania, the citizens of that area. All right? And then, of course, fast forward a few centuries, and we have the Voyage. The Europeans crossed the Atlantic, and they landed in what is today Hispaniola. Of course, Hispaniola has a totally different name that I cannot pronounce. It was used by the Taino people, who was the native people of the Caribbean. All right? But then what I'm trying to kind of tell you with these charts is something happened with the Spaniards in Central, South America, and the Caribbean, whereas in the north, in North America, we have the British coming to the north. So 2 different things, and then we'll interact over the centuries and over the years in all kinds of ways. So I just want to talk a little bit about the Treaty of Tortesis in 1494. That's 2 years after the Columbus traveled first voyage to America. So what happened, and this is fascinating, is that back in that time, you have some kingdoms that were aligned with the Pope, Catholic kingdoms, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and France. All of those are kind of romantic, kind of language, romantic Latin countries. So they were aligned with the Pope. And the Pope, back in that day, he decided is, okay, so to my partners, I'm going to split the world in 2. And he pretty much gave the Portuguese half of the world and the Spaniards the other half. And pretty much that was kind of, I'm going to start with 1452, the first papal bull in which he declared war against non-Christians. And in that papal bull, he mentioned that Christians were allowed to travel the world, and if they encounter non-Christians, they are allowed to take possessions of their goods and dominate them and just remove them. So, and that was kind of the legal background that allowed the Spaniards and the Portuguese to travel the world and just conquer. And the same thing applied to Northern America. In 1493, the Spanish Pope, Alexander VI, issued another papal bull in which he says, this is the line that I would like to highlight, is 300 miles west of the islands of Cape Verde in the Atlantic. So west of that will be for the Spaniards, and east of that, it will be for the Portuguese. And as you can see in that line, the Portuguese were kind of getting just a tiny little piece of Brazil. So they gathered together, the kings of back in that day of Portugal and Spain, and say, hey, we have to do something about it. The Portuguese wanted a little bit more land in South America, whereas the Spaniards wanted a little bit more land in Asia. So 1 year later, they signed the Treaty of Tortesis in 1494 and moved that line a little west to allow Portugal to have Brazil. And on the other side of the world, the line also moved to allow the Spaniards to have access to East Asia. That's why the Philippines was a Spaniard colony. So they pretty much, through that treaty, split the world in 2 for the Portuguese. So the Portuguese kind of traveled and kind of conquered all West Africa, whereas the Spaniards end up in nowadays Latin America. All right? So it's interesting to see how the politics of that time kind of split the world into, and kind of the Pope back in that day say, hey, you take half of the world and you take the other half. Fascinating. So the origins of the term Latin America. There's some controversy about this, but most historians agree that the Napoleon III, he was trying kind of to separate all the colonies different from the Anglo colonies. So he was, I would like to identify all the colonies that have Latin culture, either belong to France, Spain, Portugal, or Italy. All of those Latin countries. And he was like, those are the Latin American colonies. So he was throughout history, a lot of people have been trying kind of to put together a lot of different people under a single term for political purposes. And nowadays, we can say the same thing about Hispanics, politicians saying, we would like to pursue the Latino vote, whereas Latinos are very diverse, but they are just put a lot of different people under one label for political purposes. So Napoleon III was kind of one of those politicians back in the day, kind of saying that he was trying to look to have all these Latin colonies together just as a way to compete and protect himself from the threat of the Teutonic Europe, which is the Germanic kind of base kind of type of colonies, and the Anglo-Saxon colonies in the Americas, and the Slavic Europe, which is kind of tied to Russia and the Slavic states. And actually, Napoleon III was defeated by the Germans. That was the end of them. He was defeated by that threat by the Germans. So, and as you can see, France, right here, we have, that's why Cinco de Mayo is the Battle of Puebla, which is the Mexican, when the Mexican defeated the French, because the French was trying to establish more influence in Latin America. So, but if we think about that, if the beginning of Latin America was all the Latin colonies, so we have to include the French colonies, which will include Canada and Haiti. But over the years, that was discontinued. At the beginning, that was the fact. But over the years, they kind of dropped Canada out of that, and they just remain with the Spanish-speaking countries and Brazil. So fast forward from 1492 to the first census in U.S. history in 1790. Back in that day, the population was 3.9 million people in the United States. And the United States was pretty much what you have in color to the right, the colonies, the Northwest Territory, and some disputed territories as well. Whereas to the west, you have Spain. And that's why you can hear a lot of people, a lot of Hispanics or Latinos, especially in Texas, in those western states, in the Southwest, saying, we didn't cross the border crossed us, because we were always here. And Spain was all that gray area back in the day. So, and actually Alaska was Russian territory, and eventually the colony of Louisiana will become kind of a French possession. But that's kind of the beginning of the first census in 1790. Fast forward 100 years, 1 century, and the population went from 3.9 million to 62 million people. That's 1,500% increase. That's amazing. If we have that very same growth, population growth today, in the next 100 years, the US will have to go from like 300 million people to about 5 billion people. So, but population-wise is slowing down. So, but in the census of 1890, it was the first time that the race question was introduced, in 1890. And they what I like to highlight is, well, they have white, black, but mulatto, which is a very common word that we use in Latin America. Latinos are very familiar with that term, which is the mix of the white and black race. That's a mulatto. But they also have the quadron, the octron question, if you are 1/4 white or 1/8 white, that type of thing. So they have that in 1890. Fast forward another 100 years, we're going to be moving very quickly throughout history. And in 1990, you have about 250 million people in the US. The population growing one century, 295%, not 1,500%. As you can see, it's slowing down, but it still is a lot of growth. So let's go back a little bit and start with the census of 1930. For the first time and only time, Mexican was listed as a race. But then, what happened back in that day is that when the white people, they have privilege, they have access to other things. So when these questions arise, Mexicans were stopped to benefit from those things. So the Mexican government protested. The U.S. government was like, they were kind of, back in that day, they have a good neighbor policy, so they decided to drop that question for the 1940 census for that very same reason. So Mexicans, for the longest time, were considered white for the census. In 1917, and actually I'm gonna go before 1917 to 1968. In 1968, President Lyndon Johnson, it was brought to his attention that there was this kind of a homogeneous group of people in the US who has been growing steadily, and they didn't know how to call them. So the census people gathered together and they said, hey, there's this group of people that is kind of, they are similar, same culture, language, but we don't know how to call them, so they came up with the word Hispanic. And they decided, okay, we are gonna start measuring this group. And in 1969, they decide, okay, we're gonna start kind of tracking the Hispanic population, and that appears in the 1970 for the first time, the census of 1917, the question about are you Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Central or South American, or other Spanish people. And then they discovered that this emerging group of the nation's population were almost 5% of the US back in that day. So it was the first time that they were tracking the Hispanic population, and they there's this group that we need to pay attention to. Of course, in 1968, Lyndon Johnson declared the Hispanic Heritage Week, and then Ronald Reagan will expand that in 1988 to Hispanic Heritage Month. And in 1980, the word Latino was adopted. And Latino and Hispanic is almost like freeway and highway. If you go to California, people use Hispanic. If you come to the East Coast, the word Latino is kind of most commonly used, but both of them are interchangeable. And so you have that. So fast forward to today. In yellow here, we have the 2020 census. There's 331 million people in the US. It's interesting because my daughter was born in 2009, and she was born in January of 2009. And the census were there was this gigantic prize for citizen number 300 million. And I told my wife, my daughter might be that baby 300 million. But baby 300 million was hit, I believe, was in November of 2008. And my daughter was born like 50 or 60 days after. But I was kind of, what is the price for that? All right? But nowadays, Hispanics are about 18.5% of the US population, which is about 61 million people right now. When I got here in the year 2000, it was about 42, 43 million people. And then you have the other composition. So it's really interesting. The white population right now, which is 60.1%, in the year 2045, is projected to become the largest minority group in the country, which means less than 50%. It will be 49.5%. Whereas Latinos by the year 2045 will be about 25% of the US population. Still, white people will be the majority of the country, and they will be in the hundreds of millions, but it will be the largest minority group rather than the majority group right now. All right, so just a refresher about Hispanic Heritage Month, September 15 to October 15, because the celebration of the independence days of all those Latin American countries on September 15, which is Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. And of course, Mexico on September 16, and Chile on September 18. And also the Indigenous Day, October the 12th, falls inside the month of celebration. So some terms that you might hear here and there is, the first one is Taino. Taino, again, is the native population of Puerto Rico, the island of Puerto Rico, and Española. So it was the native tribe of the Caribbean. So if you talk to Puerto Ricans, they sometimes use the word Taino, Taino, Taino here, Taino there. They are very proud about that heritage. And actually the Taino, they have a word for hurricanes in their language, which was hurricane. And then hurricane was, the Spaniards start kind of using huracan, and then it was adopted into the English language as well as hurricane. Boricua. Boricua goes back centuries. It was the name that the Taino people have to the island of Puerto Rico, which was Boriquen. They call that island Boriquen. And nowadays, Puerto Ricans, they say, I'm Boricua. You might have heard that multiple times. It's very common. Whereas Chicano is a name that Mexican Americans adopted, Mexican Americans born in the US. So that's a term that you use a lot in California, Texas, Chicano, and in Chicago as well. And that was the Chicano movement of the 60s, which was tied to the civil rights movement as well. With Chavez. So I have pictures of all of that. But those are all the terms that you might encounter about Latinos. There is a term when I was talking about the mulatto question. There is one term that is very common in Latin America, extremely common, that you don't use here in the US, and it's mestizo. Have you ever heard about that word? If mulatto is the mix of the white race and the black race, mestizo is the mixture of the white Europeans with native or indigenous peoples in South America and Central America. And actually, the vast majority of the population in Latin America is mestizo. So in Ecuador, the country that I come from, about 8% of the population will self-identify as white, whereas about, I would say, 60-70% will self-identify as mestizo. And then the indigenous populations in Latin American countries is very, very big. In my home country, 17%, which is about the same size of the Latino population here in the US. So the indigenous or Native Americans or native tribes in Latin America are still very strong. So the majority of people, like in my home country, 17% is native, about 60-something% is mestizo, and only about 10% is white. All right, but that's kind of a situation, because when you come here to America and I just did the census questionnaire, and it's like, which race are you? For me, it's like I usually look for mestizo, and I don't find that. So I put usually white. And what happens is that about half of the Hispanics or Latinos in the US, they self-identify themselves as white. All right? Hispanic Latino is not a race, it's an ethnic group. Ethnicity is a group that share a lot of common things: religion, Catholic religion, language, Spanish, food, culture, those type of things. So let's go back to Latin America. I love this chart because in Latin America you have 19 countries. And then you have all those countries over there, and at the top of that table you have 630 million people. When you add all those countries together. So you have 630 million people, which is about $4.5 trillion market. Then if you add Spain has about 46 million people, and they have an economy that is about $1.8 trillion big. So if you add the Latino market Latin America to Spain, you have about $6 trillion in GDP. But if you add the 61 million Latinos that lives in the US, which is a 1.7 trillion market, you end up having a 7.5 trillion Hispanic market overall. So if you are Goya, the brand of Latino food that you have in the supermarkets, your market will be about $7-something trillion for you to conquer. And it will be in the neighborhood of about 750 million people. So it's a very large market. The European Union is about 400 million people, 28 countries. Latin America is 19 countries. And with all of that, including the Hispanic market in the US, you'll have a market of about $7.5 trillion. So going back to the US, here's where Latinos are. And this is the type of chart that generate comments about an invasion from the South. They are all over the place. They are taking over. Is that so? These charts are just charts. And they show you where they are. Of course, I can paint those states in green, in red, in blue. It all depends. But what you are seeing there is that the majority of Hispanics are in the Mexican border, Florida, New Jersey, and New York area. Now, again, this is just to show you where they are. Here, I'm not sure if you are able to read, but California has about 15 million Latinos, Texas 11.5 million, and Florida is almost 6 million Latinos. So the entire Latino population of Florida is about twice the size of the entire population of Puerto Rico, which is fascinating, and it's growing fast. But again, this is the type of chart that I can generate that type of rhetoric. But if I go by county, not by state, but by county, we have a different picture. So in orange, we have the white population. In green, we have where Latinos are kind of the majority group. And then in blue, we have where blacks are the majority. And then we have in California a little kind of pink, which is Asian Americans, where they are the majority. And in California, in Southern California, you have that big county, San Bernardino, which is about 20 times the size of Rhode Island, and it has only 2 million people living there. So, but this is the type of chart that can explain why a lot of people is saying, oh, Latinos are gonna make the difference in the next election, and they are not making the difference in the next election. You go here and they say, oh yes, they are gonna conquer. No. Their influence is limited, yet. And in the future as well, in the near future as well. We're going to need to have the same type of growth, population growth within the Hispanic Latino population to make a significant dent maybe in 25 years or more. That doesn't mean that they can not change the course of situations, but it's not kind of a done deal. That's what I'm trying to say. So let's see about Hispanics. So first chart, 2019, 18.5% of the US population. 2021, we are at 18.7%. So, and here there are some projections as well. I'll go a little faster. So Hispanic owned firms, you have in California more than 70,000 firms owned by Hispanics. Florida is second, even more than Texas. And actually, Hispanics is the second most entrepreneurial group in the nation after Asian Americans. So, and that's if the Hispanics in the US were a separate country, will be the 7th largest economy in the world right now. Here's the largest Latino population by states. Mexicans are right now 61.4% of the total Hispanic population. When I arrived to the US in the year 2000, they were 66%. So their percentage is going down. And South Americans and other countries from Latin America are kind of taking over. What I like to point here is that although Hispanics are 18.7% of the US population right now, for the under 18 years old, they are 30.8. So they are very young. So, and as you can see the future. So because when they become older, that's going to be the percentage of the Hispanic population for the country. And actually, I believe I have that blue number up there. The median age for Hispanics is 29, whereas for the US is 39, 10 years more. And if you go to where I spent 12 years of my life, to New Hampshire, to the beautiful state of New Hampshire, is 42 and a half, almost 43 years old. So language, 71% of Hispanics speak Spanish at home, and 28% report that they don't speak English that well or at all. They are not fluent in English. So that means because there's a big number of them that you acquire the language takes some time. So educational attainment, that's an important thing. 70.5% of Hispanics have a high school degree, whereas it's 93, almost 94% for the white population. So there's a gap there. They are lagging behind. 17.6 have a college degree, whereas almost 37% for the white population. Now, when I got here in the year 2000, it was 10%. So it went from 10 to 17.6%, almost double in 20 years, which is good. I mean, the trend is good. Back in the year 2000, the educational attainment college degree for Black Americans were 18%, and now they are at 23%. They are also growing. And 5.6% of Hispanics have a graduate or advanced professional degree, whereas the white population is almost 15%. So the divide, the gap is kind of becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, which is a good trend, because if Latinos are going to become 125 million people in 20, 30 years, you want to have them educated. Right now, they're lagging behind in socioeconomic status, and that's kind of is dragging the Hispanic group a little bit down. But when they become more than 120 million people, they are going to drag the entire country down. So you need to provide educational opportunity and education and economic opportunity to them. Because you want to be, in 50 years, you want to be a country with the best demographic profile and not have the demographic profile of a developing country. So that's why it's so important to open the doors of opportunity to all minority groups, because they are kind of becoming more important in the nation makeup. So in terms of demographics, the chart says that 52% of all the population growth has been fueled by Hispanics, and then by Asian Americans. And actually, Asian Americans are growing faster than the Hispanics, but they are in a smaller group overall. And then by African Americans as well, 17%, whereas the white population is decreasing. And you probably have heard conversations about how Japan is going to have half of the population in like 20, 30 years from now. Italy, the same thing. Spain, the same thing. Russia is going to go from 148 million people to about 80 million people in no time. So they have policies in place to attract immigrants. In Spain, they have these policies, and they are signing agreement after agreement with a lot of countries just to import people, because otherwise you have these towns that are becoming ghost towns. And in Italy, you probably have heard or received an email saying, hey, you can get a brand new, not a brand new home, but a home in Italy for €1 if you promise to live there for at least 3 years. So Google that and you'll see there is a lot of real estate offering in Italy for €1. But you have to buy the property. Sometimes you will need about a little makeover, and then you can move there, because those countries are losing population. That's not the case with the US, but it is the case with the white population. So the growth mostly in the South. South is gaining population. When I live in New Hampshire, I used to tell my colleagues up there that New England was like a race of turtles, and New Hampshire was the fastest turtle. But all the excitement and the movement was in the South. The population growth in New Hampshire was barely noticeable, whereas here in the South and in the West, you have the numbers. But it's in the South, and Florida is super dynamic. You have states like Texas and Florida, they look more like China, with like growing very fast in every possible way. Here you have these dots. So very busy chart, but what I would like to explain is California that gained 1.5 million Latinos, but California is 40 million people. Florida is 20 million and gained 1.4 million people, almost the same number with half the population. So Latinos are moving to Florida very fast, very fast. A lot of people say Miami is the capital of Latin America, as New York City is the capital of the world. So it's the same thing. So if you live in Latin America, eventually you're going to move your branch to Florida. That's your entry to the US market pretty much. And in Texas, 2 million new Latinos. But I would like to bring your attention to Georgia. Georgia gained about 200,000 Latinos with a population of 10 million, 10.5 million. So, and the North Atlantic states, the Carolinas, they're gaining Latino population as well. So here, the first On this side, we have Illinois, Connecticut, West Virginia, and Vermont. All those 4 states are decreasing in population. And the only population that is growing is the minorities. Hispanics are growing. And even with the growth of minorities, the overall state population is declining. So they are in trouble. They are going to end up being like the Italy, Japan, or Russia that I mentioned before. On this side, those states, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New Mexico, Rhode Island, and Mississippi are barely growing and fueled by the minority groups. And on this side, you have states like the first top 3, Texas, California, Florida, which are growing a lot. And more than half of that growth is due by the Hispanic population. Now, let's talk about the future elections. I promise not to make this controversial, but there are some important numbers here that I would like to highlight. So the first thing, this is the white population is decreasing as a percentage of the electorate nationwide. And you can see Nevada right there is decreasing by a lot. And that's a swing state. So you have that. It's decreasing in Florida, Texas, Arizona. You have that. And now if you look at the Latino population, not surprisingly, they are growing in big numbers in California as a percentage of the electorate. But they are growing in Texas, in Florida. Arizona again. Arizona was, in the last election, was won by only 10,000 votes. So it's like a slight move in the needle can create a change in that state. So it's important. When you see the black population, you see Georgia. So Latinos are growing in Georgia. Blacks are growing in Georgia. Whites are not growing in Georgia. So you have the perfect storm heading in that direction. The same thing Arizona and Nevada. New Mexico is mostly Hispanic, but Arizona is not that the case. So, and Texas is being declared a purple state. So it is a purple state nowadays. And then you have the Asian population. You have also growing all over the place. They are growing fast as well. So this is an important chart for me. If you see, this is the point advantage of Democrats with the Latino population. So in the election of 2016, Hispanics or the Democratic Party, they have almost about 37 points advantage over Republicans nationwide. And then the following election, that advantage went down. So this is something that is amazing to me, and actually I think it was a big kind of, almost like a breakthrough situation for a lot of people that is monitoring this type of thing. You have the candidate, the Republican candidate in 2016 with a very harsh rhetoric about Latinos, and everybody was expecting that they were going to suffer on election day. And actually, that was the Republican candidate that harnessed the biggest Latino support ever. And even more in 2020, after the implementation of very harsh policies. That harnesses a lot of Latino support. So that was took by surprise to a lot of people. And actually it was Latino men that drove in hurdles over the Republican candidate. So in Arizona, what happened was the opposite. And again, Republicans lost by 10,000 votes. And in Arizona, Latinos made a difference for the Democrats. But in Florida in 2016, 30,000 votes was the difference. And in 2020, a lot of people were like, Republicans are doomed because after Hurricane Maria, 200,000 Puerto Ricans moved to the US, 100,000 of them moved to Florida, many of them to Central Florida, to the I-4 corridor. They were kind of doing, no, it's impossible for Republicans to win. And then 2020 came, and then instead of winning by 30,000 votes, they win by 500,000 votes. Everybody was scratching their heads. What happened? So Latinos play a role in Arizona in favor of the Blue Party and in favor of the GOP in Florida. So go figure. But definitely they can play a role in the Southwest and in the South. But then their numbers are growing. So that's important, and how these two parties play their cards is going to be important with this minority group. But what I'm trying to showcase with that is that it's so difficult to forecast. What I can tell you is that if you have a similar candidate in the next election, presidential election, to President Trump, you're going to have a similar result with Hispanics. Florida will be kind of a done deal for the GOP here. But what happened in the West is a different, or in the North is a different situation. So Florida Hispanic voters, well, in general, Florida have only 8 electoral votes by the end of World War II. And now we have, well, up until the last election, 29 electoral votes. But because Census 2000 came and produced new numbers, New York lost 1 electoral vote and we won another one. So we are 3rd in the nation after California and Texas, and not 4th. Now New York is after us. So Florida is becoming an important, very important state. And as you can see in that chart, that's the last presidential elections in 2020 versus 2016. The blue number didn't move. It's the same level of support. Was the red number that moved in favor of President Trump and went from 30,000 votes to 500,000. But in Arizona, we have the difference, a totally different situation. So what's the future? If you hear the news, it doesn't matter which outlet. If you hear Spanish media channels or newspapers, or it doesn't matter if you, who is behind those microphones, everyone is going to tell you the future is Latino, the future is brown. For me, that's not that true. For me, they are growing, which means that the future is more diverse. And that I can tell for sure. The future is going to be more diverse. That Hispanics are going to play a dominant role in the near future? No, they are going to be part of the fabric. That's the type of country that the US is going to be. So the future Latino? No, it's going to be a future, more diverse future. I have one more slide for you. With that, I'm going to end these presentations. And it's just to call your attention about the future. It's so difficult to forecast the future. It's so difficult to know how it's going to be. This is my last slide. I wanted to read it. Yeah? So, on the right, I don't care about who is inside that spacesuit. If it is brown, white, black, doesn't matter. The future is diverse. It's going to be diverse for sure, but the future is going to be different. It's not going to be about race. It's not going to be about all these things because the divides are kind of becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. Some of those issues will linger in the future as well. We'll have to perfect our societies with time, all the time. We have to keep polishing what we do as human beings, as society. But it will be more about what we conquer in the future as a civilization. And rather than who is inside of the spacesuit. But it's amazing. This can tell you exactly. And this is 66 years is the difference between a grandfather and a newly baby-born granddaughter or son. All right. So that's my presentation. If you have questions, I think we have about 15 minutes. Thank you so much.